Roughly 2 months ago, an archaeogenetic study was published on ancient Carthaginian samples from across the western Mediterranean, from sites in Sardinia, Sicily, Spain, and even the city of Carthage itself. The results were surprising to some, but they were not surprising to anyone who read the previous DNA study on ancient Punic samples from Carthaginians or know anything about the history of Carthaginian and Phoenician trade in the western Mediterranean. The results of this new study show that the Carthaginians' ancestry is derived from Iron Age Sicilians and Greeks, with little Levantine or North African admixture. The paper states, quote, "Instead, these inheritors of Levantine Phoenician culture derived most of their ancestry from a genetic profile similar to that of Sicily and the Aegean. Much of the remaining ancestry originated from North Africa, reflecting the growing influence of Carthage. However, this was a minority contributor of ancestry in all of the sampled sites, including in Carthage itself." I have some thoughts on this fascinating study. As I said, these results weren't really shocking to me, considering the trade links and interactions between the Phoenicians and Greeks, then later the Carthaginians and Greeks, especially in Sicily. Sure, there were several military conflicts between the Carthaginians and Magna Graeca Greeks, most notably in 367 BCE, with Hanno the Great's naval victory over the Greeks in Sicily, and many of the primary sources from archaic and classical Greek authors do not portray the Phoenicians and Carthaginians in the best light, which is part of the reason why some modern historians come away with the view that Carthage was degenerate and inferior to Greco-Roman civilization. The Greek historian Timaeus is a prime example, as he portrayed Carthage as an agent of the barbarous Orient in the West. But if you look at everyday Sicilian Greeks and the Western Phoenicians, and more broadly Sicilian Greek and Punic culture, you will actually find there was a substantial amount of cultural exchange. In Sicily, Punics and Greeks were intermarrying and worshipping each other's deities, in addition to trading. The archaeological record clearly shows the cultural influence the Greeks had on Punic or Carthaginian culture. In the Punic city of Sabratha, a mausoleum commissioned by an elite Punic citizen shows Greek cultural influence with the Ionic columns and the metopes with brightly painted stucco. There has been Greek pottery found at numerous Punic sites. As previously mentioned, the Carthaginians worshipped the Greek gods, and even had their own synchronistic versions of these deities. Heracles' Melkart is the most well-known example. In fact, HannibalBarca appropriates the myth of Heracles killing Cacus to save his cattle, and he uses this myth as a form of propaganda to portray himself as the new Heracles marching over the Alps to defeat the Romans. The Greeks used myths of Heracles to justify their colonization of the western Mediterranean, and the Carthaginians used this particular myth of Heracles to justify conquering Italy. Though the Carthaginians were culturally Phoenician, the Sicilian Greeks culturally Greek, and the Romans a cultural mix of Greek and Etruscan, the genetic evidence is now clear that the Carthaginians are genetically related to the Greeks, and in a way, the Romans, since Sicily came under Roman rule after the First Punic War, and there were Greeks living in southern Italy. The Punic Wars were not conflicts between different races, but slightly different cultures with populations that were genetically similar. In a way, the Punic Wars are kind of like the military conflicts between the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. Both of these Hellenistic empires were ruled by Greco-Macedonians. There were Greeks who migrated into the territories of both, and even though both were culturally Hellenistic, the respective native cultures that synchronized with Greek culture in each empire were different. Even though the DNA evidence is clear that the vast majority of Carthaginian ancestry is Sicilian and Greek, an individual on X who has access to these samples stated that there are elite Carthaginian samples that show substantially more Levantine or Phoenician ancestry, with some of these elite samples showing majority Levantine ancestry. This would also not be surprising, since the archaeological record shows clear cultural continuity between the Carthaginians and Phoenicians. Evidence of this continuity includes Punic tuffets, temples to the Phoenician god Baal Haman, and elite tombs with amulets and scarabs depicting Egyptian deities and pharaohs. To expand on these elite tombs, the Phoenicians engaged in a substantial amount of trade with the Egyptians, and with this trade came Egyptian cultural influence on the Phoenicians. So elite burials with Egyptian goods and artifacts in Carthage are a strong indicator that there was a Phoenician mercantile class. With this evidence in mind, naturally at least the elites must have been of Levantine ancestry. If this is true, then the pattern of Phoenician colonization is remarkably similar to the colonial expansion of other civilizations, whether that be the Hellenistic Macedonians, Arabs, British, or Spanish, where it is only the elites that settle in these colonies, usually in urban centers like Carthage. The majority population is usually native or a mix of 2 or 3 different ethnic groups, but in the case of Carthage, the majority would have been Sicilians and Greeks. This likely happened because the Phoenicians and later Carthaginians had colonies in Sicily which clearly interacted with the Greeks and indigenous Sicilians, which allowed these Greeks and Sicilians to migrate to Carthage and other Punic settlements. Now, the elephant in the room, no pun intended, or maybe slightly pun intended, is what was HannibalBarca's ancestry. Based on the results from this DNA study, it seems very likely that he would have had a substantial amount of Greek ancestry, which makes sense since his tutor taught him Greek and he read Greek literature. On the other hand, the Barcids were an elite Carthaginian family, so it is probable that Hannibal had some Phoenician ancestry as well. He was likely a mix of Greek and Phoenician, but we will never be 100% sure until we find his body and sequence his genome. But for now, we can safely say the Carthaginians have a lot of genetic overlap with the Sicilians and Greeks.